Well, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to today's WEConnect International webinar, How to Disrupt Without Knowing It. My name is Maggie Berry, and I'm the Executive Director for WEConnect International in Europe, and I'm delighted that you've joined us for today's webinar. Our presenter today is another Maggie. It's Maggie Semple. She is a successful businesswoman and entrepreneur and owner of Maggie Semple Limited, a bespoke women British fashion brand and a WEConnect International certified women's business enterprise. In today's session, we're going to be exploring the power of disruption and learn how to make the intentional, unintentional, how to control subtle messages about yourself and apply this learning in a business environment. To keep background noise to minimum, participants will all be on mute, so please do use the chat functionality to ask any questions that you might have. Maggie is going to talk probably for about 40 to 45 minutes, and the session is being recorded, so if you want to listen back to it again, you will be able to. And I know that Maggie's got some questions for you throughout the presentation and again at the end. So Maggie, thank you so much for presenting for us. I'm going to pass the presenter rights over to you and put myself on mute as well. So the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
And thank you, Maggie, and thank you everyone for joining us today. I'm absolutely delighted to be working with another Maggie, so hopefully it won't get too complicated as we call each other to do various things and engage you. But it's really great to be a member not only of WEConnect International, but to be presenting today's webinar on a subject and a topic that I'm really keen to find out from you what you think too. So what it is kind of we're doing here. First I'd like to do is to thank you for joining, and I recognize some of the names, so thank you, the people that I do know, and also thank you for those who linked in with me to find out more, so that's great. I will be talking for about 40 minutes, I guess, but what I will be doing throughout is asking you to respond, to use the chat box at any time. If I'm not clear, or you want to just pause on a comment, or you'll suspend something for a second, just put it in the chat box. I'll see it, Maggie will see it too, and we can refer to it and kind of engage you even further. So for me, I'm intrigued. This is the first thing, just to warn you now. I'm intrigued about you and why you have decided to dial in now and respond to the invite. The topic, how to disrupt without knowing it. So can I invite you, please, if you're comfortable with technology, in the chat box, you just answer the question, why have you joined this session today? So off you go. Do please feel free to add a comment as I keep on encouraging you to do so. And Maggie will kind of moderate that for me. But the question is, why have you joined this webinar today? Is it because maybe I can see from some of the names you know me, so you're supporting, which thank you very much. It could be that you are part of what we might call a disruptive kind of energy force community. Kevin, that might be you, because from your LinkedIn profile, I don't think I know you very well, but from your LinkedIn interests, I wonder if that's you too. Why have you joined it? That's what I'm interested to know. So any comment? Ozlem, you might well have a comment too, as indeed Roper, Sonal, you know, you're there. Why have you joined? And we'll refer to those comments later. So I can already see, Andrea, you want to better understand what is disruption. Yeah, and I have to tell you that when I talk, of course, it's going to be from my perspective with a bit of information that I've gathered on the way, but this is equally about what you think it should be too. Interested in developing your skills, which is fantastic. So thank you, Danielle. I hope, by the way, I'm calling your names correctly. And if not, forgive me. You can perhaps help me a bit later on. So we'll just see what else you've written. You've said, why have you joined? Elizabeth says you're just curious. You're curious about the topic. Absolutely. Better understand, as I've said. Interested in hearing what you have to say. Thank you, Paulette, on that. And Maggie agrees with you. And you know Maggie, I'm very into the subject and how to put it into practice. Okay, so thank you for that. That's fantastic, and thank you for that engagement. There'll be more of this sort of stuff, so for others who haven't had a chance to yet respond, there will be other kind of questions for you to answer. So let me start off by introducing myself, then I'm going to go on to looking at the finer detail of the title. I'm going to decode it That's kind of my way of just getting underneath it. And then we're going to end with some further learning comments and thoughts and resources that you might want to use. And just to say, throughout, I will encourage you to keep on commenting and to engage in a way that we'd like to, obviously. So let me just start by saying who I am. You would have seen in my bio, and Maggie's read it out, the WEConnect International information. But I thought I would add to what you already know by drawing on 3 strands of what I do. And that, to my mind, illustrates who I am. So part of disrupting, being a disruptor, is about, I would assert, knowing who you are and being able to articulate that in a way that for you is comfortable and hopefully resonates with the people that you're describing yourself to. So here we have 3 images. 1, the scales of justice with values underneath. 2 women linked to behaviours. And 3 doors to do with choices. And when I say it like that, it sounds quite, well, I don't know, quite mystical. It doesn't mean to be. It's just that. You may see these 3 strands as being very different from each other. But to me, of course, they're connected. And they're connected not only because of me, they're me, but as I tell my story, I hope that you relate to them too. Indeed, throughout the webinar, I'll be asking you to consider what is presented and reflect on how the content relates to you. So you might want to make your own mental notes, you might want to jot down some notes. It's up to you how you deal with it. And I know that on this session we've got people from all over the world, so when I speak about the UK, I will also be speaking about the world as I understand it to make sense for all of us today. So let me start with values. Now, I've worked in the UK legal justice system for around 20 years. Currently, I'm a member of the Council Selection Panel, which means that I manage, along with others, lay and legal folk, a small group of us that we could recommend those who, through merit, should be given the title of QC, Queen's Counsel. It's a very high acknowledgement and recognition of a particular barrister or solicitor's work in the field of law. And put simply, why is this important to me as Maggie Semple? Well, the laws of England and Wales, when examined, are about the values of a society. Indeed, most laws in most jurisdictions around the world, in fact, you could argue all of them, you may not agree with all of them, say something about the values of a society. They're to do with our values, to do with our morals, they're to do with what we think basically is right and wrong. But of course the world and we as human beings aren't that simple. But in a nutshell, values are very core to who I am. And I drive a lot of my business through sifting decisions and what I think we should be doing and my team should be doing through a values perspective. The second is about behaviours. And I always say that even though I can probably never find out exactly what's in your mind, I have an indication of what's in your mind by the behaviours that you demonstrate. And in this case, I say, in this business, my Semple design business, my task is to make women happy. And we do this by designing and making luxury bespoke clothes for women in our atelier in Covent Garden, London. And there's much evidence about enclosed cognition, the psychological effect that clothes have on someone. But what I'm about, really, is to actually demonstrate through well-designed, tailored clothes that to look and feel good affects who you are. And therefore, if you feel more confident, you'll behave more confident. If you feel that when you give that presentation or you've got a team meeting, you've got a difficult message, that you feel in what you're wearing, that you feel good, then your body signature, as I call it, is pretty powerful. And the last is about choices. Now, some of you I can see on the call will know me from my other business, which works with global organizations on leadership development. It's a management firm that I run, and the leaders that I'm particularly keen on to talk to about is the choices that they make. Why have they made those choices? What's informed those choices? So leaders and how they make decisions particularly interest me. Leaders and their range of intelligences keeps me curious, and I'll come back to intelligence a bit later on. and leaders able to transform their business in an inclusive, consistent way that motivates me to keep engaged with them. I have clients in the financial, oil and gas, technology, and pharma sectors. So what is my linking narrative between all three? Well, I'm someone who is deeply values-driven, that tries to demonstrate my values through my behavior, and acknowledges that I have choices that I aim to make in a responsible way. That's what I try and do. And I test this proposition, I have to tell you, quite often. I invite feedback from the people that I work with. And it's not always rosy, of course. Sometimes I get things not right. But what I try and do is learn, of course, and make that learning visible. So let's take a look then at this webinar. The title of it, How to Disrupt Without Knowing It. Now, I don't know about you, but it could appear contradictory. And why did I ask you to do this? To bring your curiosity to it? Because that's what we need for this kind of, I think, webinar. I'd like you to be even more curious, because I know already you've said that you're interested to know what I think about it, what others think about it too. And I view this webinar as a thought piece. And it may be as a result that there'll be a shift in mindset, because I'm quite keen on how we can change mindsets of ourselves and others into new action. And so what we can see, and I've already read out in the chat box, that people, Roper, I can see you say you're always interested in what you have to say. Thank you, Roper. But I'm also working on a project supporting women as entrepreneurs, and I want to learn more. And I hope we will, be able to help Roper in some way, and that's the other Maggie actually commenting on that in some way. So again, as we interact in this webinar, we're helping each other too. So that's kind of the subject title. Let me just quickly touch on the learning points. It's about how to make the intentional unintentional, how to control those subtle messages about yourself, male or female, applying your learning in the business environment, and committing to one action, I would suggest, as a result of this webinar. So let's just think about the pre-work, as I call it, which sounds a little theoretical, doesn't it? But I did ask you to think about, and maybe again you could put this note in the chat box when you're ready. I asked you to think of a friend or a colleague if they saw you as a disruptor, and why, and why not. So if you've done that, please use the chat box now to say, you asked a friend, yeah, okay, did they see you as a disruptor? You can just say yes, and then just say why. Why did they see you as a disruptor? Or if you asked them and they said no, could you put in the chat box why they said you were not a disruptor? So can I give you just a minute for some of you to get involved and just put your comments there. The task was, prior to this webinar, to ask a friend or colleague if they saw you as a disruptor. And if they did, why? And if they didn't, why not? So have I got anyone willing to say? So Sonu, you tell me they do not see you as a disruptor. Okay, maybe you could perhaps just add something else there. Why do you think that is? So I'll leave you to get on with that, Sonu. Anybody else can say why they were or were not a disruptor? Let's see if anybody else managed to do it. I can tell you, in preparation for this webinar, I asked my own team, and they said independently of each other that yes, I was a disruptor. Maggie, yes, you're a disruptor. And actually, I think what they meant really was that I come up with lots and lots of ideas all of the time. And in meetings, I will be thinking, and then, I'll say it, and that will just disrupt, I hope in a positive way, disrupt the thinking of what we're doing, or will add another dimension. So Sonu, you say why they don't think you're a disruptor, because maybe you're too quiet. Isn't that interesting? Maybe you're too quiet and you only speak when you have the facts. Yeah, I completely understand that. And there is something about us all appreciating that not everyone needs to be noisy or loud. Okay, so thank you for that, Sonu. Danielle, thank you for engaging. You think you would be considered a disruptor in your current role as you're quite new to the organisation. So there's something about not only being quiet, as Sonu talks about, but you're now saying because you're new, you could be seen as, and maybe you've been brought in just to be disruptive because you're new, nothing more than that. Or it could be that you have something to offer that is going to just challenge some thinking. I remember once an organisation invited me in to work with them for a short while, and they just said I was a weapon of mass inspiration, which was a little fighting talk. But it was because they thought that I could bring some enthusiasm to a team and therefore disrupt it in a positive way. And that, I think it worked in that way. Okay, so thank you for that. Others of you be thinking of this, if you are a disruptor or not disruptor, just think about kind of why and if not. So let me just move on to how to disrupt without knowing. And I've just broken it down. I'm going to decode it, and I'm going to spend a few minutes going through each of the little, what I call, chapters. So the how-to suggests to me practical advice, and that's what I'm going to end with, some practical advice. And again, your contribution will be very well received. I'm also going to talk then about disruption, and I see it as part of innovation, and I see it as positive. But I am going to talk about disruption in a negative way too. And I need to say this and own it, because disruption, I think, is about us too and how we perceive ourselves. And then the without knowing is, for me, the piece that exercises me the most. It's the without knowing suggests that you don't know, and therefore any disruption is unintentional. And I think this is about making that intentional. If you know that you don't know, it's about making that intentional. So let's move on. Let's just start with this without knowing, because as a sentence construction, how to disrupt without knowing. To decode it, for me, I've had to go the other way. Without knowing, disrupt, and then the how to. So let's start with the knowing. And for me, to know the unintentional and the intentional starts with knowing what are your strengths. So already in the last 15, 20 minutes, I've introduced, for you to, for me to be able to look at this topic, I've suggested it's really helpful if you know who you are by the way that you describe yourself. I describe myself with 3 strands coming together, and how I live my life, and how certainly I run my businesses or aim to. Now I'm saying to you, so when we dig a little bit deeper, this without knowing concept, I think, starts with knowing who you are with your strengths. And I ask myself, and I'd like you to think about this as I go through my story in answering these questions, if you want to know what your strengths are, you could ask yourself what your strengths are, and you could ask others, what do you do well? And by asking that, it's a simple question. I think, depending on who you ask, of course, people that perhaps know you well and like you, people that know you well and you find a bit of a challenge might also be a starting point for a discussion. But what do you do well? So ask yourself and others, what do you do well? Then I move to a totally different topic, which is, what made you different as a child? And I'll come back to why that's important to me. You'll have maybe other questions you want to ask yourself about your strengths, but this is what I use. What made you different as a child? And then, and particularly for women, I would assert, but again, it's for people to say on the call whether this is true or not, which compliments do you habitually dismiss? And I would assert that women, we tend not to be, or we're still learning how to get better at not dismissing compliments. But again, I'll come back to that. So that's where I'm going to start. It's this without knowing. How do you make the unintentional and the intentional either way round, so that the without knowing is not just random, it is just not kind of superficial, it's actually part of who you are. So let's just think about then, and this is my story, what do I do well? So what I do, and I don't know if you do this, but occasionally, well actually every couple of years, I work with psychologists, different ones actually over time, and I undertake various psychological tests just to keep me, grounded, but also to think about what else I can learn about myself and how I impact on others. And what I found out when I undertook the Clifton Strengths Finder was that this is what I do well. And I'm going to give you broad statements because you might well again chime in with this. But my profile tells me that my 5 major strengths are connectedness, deliberative, strategic, input, learner. And what does that mean? Well, connectedness is I have a faith in the links among all things. I believe there are few coincidences in life and in the world. There are some, but very few. And that almost everything has a meaning. So that's me, Maggie. And when I work with my team, I have been through all of this so they understand me better. And indeed, when some of them have their own tests, another perhaps kind of test or the same one, we then can look across ourselves. What really motivates us? What do we do well? Where would I be best placed in a project? Deliberative means that I take serious care in making decisions or choices. And I anticipate obstacles. Now, I anticipate obstacles, but it doesn't mean to say that stops me taking a decision. But it is about being deliberative. It is about assessing and taking care in making decisions. In strategic, I create alternative ways to proceed. Faced with any given scenario, I can quickly spot the relevant patterns and issues. So I'm quite what I describe a pattern-y person. That means I'm quite good at looking at detail, spreadsheet, colours, patterns of any sort, code, and make some sense of it. So it's quite interesting for me just to think about how my strategic thinking impacts my day-to-day life. I can spot quickly relevant patterns. Input, I have a craving to know more. I'd like to collect and archive all kinds of information. And that's just me hungry curious about you. And thank you, Kevin, for your message. Brilliant, thank you for that. But it's just about me wanting, I can't learn enough, I guess. I can't have enough. And then the learner piece is I have a great desire to learn and want to continuously improve. The process of learning, rather than the outcome, excites me. I've done the outcome stuff. I've taken exams, I've been successful or not successful, the degree pace and all those other things. I've done that and continue to do it. But what I'm more interested in is the process of continuous learning, continuously improving. Now, of all these things, the things that I do well, I'm told, I try to give them some kind of integrity. They sound like me. I believe them, and therefore I be them. I become them even more. But of course, every single of these 5 aspects does have its dark side or its different side. Particularly, I'm just going to mention social media, of which I'm a great believer. I use a lot, I hope strategically, I hope in a connected way. I learn from it. But I understand not just social media, but every position I present to you today has a dark side to it or a different side. But this is what I do well, and I celebrate that. So this is an example of me knowing intentionally. I know and I agree with what I do well. So I guess for you, just a thought, you don't have to answer it, but just have a thought as a takeaway. So what do you do well, and how do you know? Have you asked a colleague, a friend, someone that you go in a shop and you meet? I mean, just these random people. Who do you ask so that you know what you do well? So let's now turn to what made me different as a child. And a bit later on, I'm going to come back to why I've asked you that question, because this work has informed me, has been informed by a particular person who writes a lot about disruption, who I very much admire. But let's turn to what made me different as a child. Well, for me, and some of you will know this, it was my colour. Now, a bit of a taboo subject, possibly, but probably not. I think we're all adults and grown-ups, and I can tell from the call and who's on it and where people are from in the world that we are not only very diverse, thank goodness, but I will speak for myself. I'm a black, British-born woman, and for me, an example of what made me different, because I needed something to reflect to me, to tell me that I was different, because my home was like me, was my primary school. And indeed, the after-school clubs that I was very engaged in, because there were very few, if any, other black children in them. And it was being the different person that made me realize that I was different. How did I respond? Well, I had strong parents, and they helped me understand that my colour was my superpower. Now, I don't say that as a precocious child or a very arrogant adult. It's just used positively. I think probably from quite a young age, but I'm not sure how young I was, but certainly today, I think when I use what I call my superpower, which is a quiet superpower inside of me, a bit like Sonal saying, maybe I'm a bit too quiet sometimes and people are not quite sure until I speak up about the facts. But maybe my superpower, which is quietly inside of me, when I use it positively, I think it helps others appreciate my perspective on things, on topics. It informs my perception and belief in myself. And my father was an engineer, and he taught me how to use my superpower while conserving energy. My voice is my voice. I gesture with my hands. I call myself an ambivert. I'm not necessarily an extrovert, or an introvert. I think I do it fairly well, flex my verts, depending on the situation. But conserving my energy, I've always done. If anyone sees a picture of me as a child, or has seen a picture of me as a child, or you see a picture of yourself, when you look at someone's eyes, or you look at them, you think, with me, you'd see she conserves energy. How does that show itself today in a business environment? Well, I talk about my calmness, my inner calmness, and about how I aim, in my way, to turn things that I think are incorrect or wrong, the way that people treat other people, into a right. And I relate this work in the justice system I spoke of earlier, and also my corporate work with leaders in global organizations. This is, so for me, an example of moving the unintentional knowing, that is, I'm a black woman, so I cannot be held responsible for how others perceive me, but into intentional knowing. But I know the impact without trying to be deviant in any way in terms of being psychologically tricksy with anyone. But I do know that when I walk into a room on some occasions, being who I am and what I represent is challenging for the majority of the people in the room, because most people don't look like me still today. So I'm turning my unintentional knowing, I'm not sure the impact that I have, into, but Maggie, you're going to have it, so it's intentional. You know that's the case. So I guess my question for you is, what made you different as a child? Can you turn that difference into a superpower? And yours could be whatever you think it should be. I've used my colour because it's very strong for me, it's very important to me, but it could be anything that's important to you. And finally, we come to, which compliments do you habitually dismiss? Now, you already know the answer to this. I've given you already a spoiler alert, you could call it. Comments such as, Maggie Berry, for example, I'll pull you out. You're really good at contributing to meetings. I'm going to call someone else. Veronica, you look really well. And I'll call Helena. The quality of that present for Helena was just exemplary. The trouble for all of us who habitually dismiss a pattern of compliments is that it discounts what we're worth, and this ultimately reduces our trading power of skill, experience, and knowledge compared to others. And if nothing else, we convince ourselves that we're not good at whatever the compliment suggests. Now, I'm going to just say here, from my perspective, and as a woman, I've almost trained myself to, when I hear someone say, Maggie, you look great, or Maggie, that was a really good point, my impulsive kind of thinking goes, no, I don't, or, are you sure? Really? And I've had to train my brain and train my thinking to actually say when I hear a comment, before I open my mouth, just pause for a second. And I usually just say thank you, just as I kind of process what's being said. But there is something about, and I would say particularly women, we know we've still got more to do in this area. Again, when we start to have questions later on, you might just want to raise that with me. And over the years, I kind of think about, so why am I like this? What is it? Why am I prone to doing this still? Even I say to other women particularly and other people, let's not try and do this. How can I frame a different response to a compliment and do so intentionally? Well, I tell you, a psychologist who's I really have followed over many decades actually is Howard Gardner, who is a professor of psychology at Harvard University. And he's written extensively on mindset and intelligence. And I did say earlier on, didn't I, that if we can get some mindset change possibly in this webinar, fantastic. Gardner describes 5 mindsets, and I apply those to my leadership work with global companies. And they are the mindsets of the disciplined mind, the synthesizing mind, the creating mind, respectful mind, and the ethical mind. And when I think about Gardner's studies, this is all about me being kind of not only different, but what compliments do I habitually dismiss to understand myself better. Gardner talks about intelligence and has many intelligence studies, but of them, there's one that I particularly relate to. And he describes it, and I think it's me, about searchlight intelligence. That is someone who can make connections across spheres, who can connect the dots between people and ideas. And my earlier slide of behavior, values, and choices is exactly summarized in this searchlight intelligence. So when I get a compliment, not only do I have to pause and first of all say thank you. I don't think we say thank you enough to people, I have to say, but I say thank you. And then I synthesize very quickly in my own mind what the comment has been and what my response will be. But the way that I do it is apply searchlight intelligence. I kind of scan the horizon of my mind of what I've heard before, what I believe is true, and I hope make a sensible, meaningful, thoughtful response so that we can carry on the discussion. So I guess here what I'm saying is, under this, without knowing piece is, once I'm able to turn my without knowing, intentional and unintentional, into my strengths, I can then turn that into positive disruption. So let's take a look. And Veronica, I can see you on screen, so hi to you. You've got your webcam on. I can see that we've got this disrupt piece, innovation and positive. And just to say that when we look at disruption, again, you'll have your own definition. That I'm conscious that many of you will continue to have yet to innovate, and whatever that means to you, by creating new products, whatever that product is. And a product can be an idea, by the way. It doesn't have to be a hard, tangible thing. It can be an idea. I'm a great believer in that. And the value networks that surround that product. And most disruptors, many of you on this call, many of you that run your own businesses, you will know that you've created something because you've identified a need that's not being met well. For me, in my kind of clothing business, it's about women, usually 38 plus, if I'm honest, just because of the seniority of where they are in business and what they're up to. Just finding it more difficult to buy clothes and find clothes that fit them well, make them feel good. But we're also not only good at doing that, finding the niche, we're also good at the emergent strategy. That is, having the confidence to step forward, gather feedback, and adapt. And if I'm honest, and you might be honest with me too, if I'm honest, my business plan isn't perfect. It actually is not beautifully crafted, I would suggest, but it is a living, of course, document that sets out the values clearly, and it improves as we reiterate ourselves and we move on. And actually, as a disruptor, as Maggie, I'm not quite good at revolution. I'm far more able and comfortable with the iterative, the evolutionary style of disrupting. So I see disruption in a very positive way. And I think more of us that see this and believe that we're put somewhere where we've found ourselves in a situation that we can harness our superpower, use it positively. Personally, I think the world, but certainly the business environment, could be a happier place to be. That's my comment on disruption. And the final thing, and then I'm going to pause in about 5 minutes to give time for you to make any comments, is about the how-to, practical advice. So let's think about how you make the intentional unintentional. So you've got something in your mind, let's call it that, and you want to make it unintentional. So let me tell you what I think this is about. It's about you being obviously conscious about being unintentional. And I think there's a power in being unintentional. Doesn't mean to say that you are, you just throw things away in terms of ideas, you're dismissive. No, it's an active thing. So I know the impact of the colour of my skin, as I said earlier, and coupled with my gender, that impacts on others. In most environments, to be honest, it's really positive, and that's great. Sometimes, however, as I said, the impact is negative, and I have to say when I look around the world, when I see what's happening in different parts of the world as well as the UK, just on colour, not anything else, and I speak from my perspective, of course, there's still too much, disharmony. It's just too disconnected. It's too broken, I think, in terms of the positiveness that we can harness for humanity. But I no longer distract myself or discount my worth because I know that's in the background, the negative aspects. I don't do that. If you want to be associated with me, you have to come to terms with who I am, because there's some things I can't or won't change, and that becomes my superpower. I don't think I'm arrogant. I don't think I'm obstinate. I don't think. But let me tell you, I'm not going to change my colour, even though there's medical things that could help me possibly if I want to. I'm not going to change my gender. I don't want to, even though I could. I want to be intentionally unintentional. And what does that say to me? Well, I first of all have to practice that. And then I have to make those behaviours, saying thank you, thinking it through, habitual, so that it becomes second nature. And therefore, it's unintentional, I would assert. I don't, in my world of possibly utopia, but I won't necessarily need to stress too much of who I am because of what you can see, because I'm already comfortable with it. And what I won't know, of course, and can't take too much responsibility for is if, as I meet you, see you, describe who I am, that I let it go with you. And that's when it becomes unintentional. I can't be held responsible for the impact of that necessarily. So making the intentional unintentional to me is about being comfortable with who you are, being clear about who you are, practicing it, saying it if you need to, calling it out, becoming second nature, and then it becomes unintentional. This is who I am, I present myself, and I let it go. And it goes out, and it spreads, and it ripples through. How does this resonate with you is what I would just say. Just have a think about that. The next time you go to a meeting, it's literally things like, don't always sit in the same seat. That's why I always say to women, particularly on boards, don't always sit in the same seat. That just juice up slightly. How to control subtle messages about yourself? Well, every so often I ask a colleague to observe me in action. I receive feedback once about my global webinars that invite people to engage by coming off mute and speaking. And you know what, and this is me being really honest, sometimes I cannot pronounce people's names. And it was pointed out to me, Maggie, you know, you're great, you're good. I go, thank you. But you do realise there are parts of the world, sometimes in parts of the world and regions, where you do not ask people by their names to contribute, to come off mute and talk. You just call them by the region of the country. And I go, really? They go, yeah, that's really clear. So for me, I need to control those subtle messages about myself, because what the message was being given was, Maggie, you don't care about these people, you haven't even had time to learn how to say their names, it's not really good enough, and it's for me to control those subtle messages. So again, being conscious of who you are, but also making sure that you get feedback from a trusted friend. And then what about I would just say to you, what about the feedback you receive about the messages that you're giving off? Are you aware of them? And then this kind of last area before we take into action is, how do you apply any learning from what I've said, but the learning that you are acquiring about yourself into the business context? And for me, I'm known for, but hopefully I do it respectfully, I actually move conversation into action. I have thoughts and opinions, I hope, as you will of course do, and when I move the conversation into action, it gives me the opportunity to step back, analyse myself before stepping forward. That's the strategic part of me. But the way I do it is in small steps, and it's iterative. But what I talk about is I call things out. So I kind of package myself and say, this is who I am. I can't necessarily be responsible for all the unintentional things about myself, but I'm going to be intentional about the unintentional of what I can control. But what I will say is that when I apply my whole self, and often businesses particularly talk about, we want employees, staff to be happy by bringing their best selves, their whole selves to work. Well, I bring myself to anything that I do, but I do call things out. And that's how I apply who I am and how to disrupt with knowingly or without knowing it by way of calling things out. So for me, it's about, what are we going to do? What one action might you think about doing? Now, before we just move over, just a deeper dive, just so that you're aware, and then Maggie, I'm going to hand back to you. It's to do with what's informed me as a starting point for this kind of webinar. And this webinar, I guess, I just call it part of not only mindset shift, thought piece, but it's about me contributing to the sharing economy. So Clifton's Strengths Finder, I've talked about. There I had psychometric tests, and I found out currently what my 5 major strengths are. Howard Gardner I've mentioned. He writes a lot on multiple intelligences. I mentioned the 5 minds for the future he describes. And Whitney Johnson, who is a great author. Some of you will know the work, Disrupt Yourself. That's where my childlike question came from, because she has identified several key indicators, key factors, to know how to be a successful disruptor. So you know what, I'm going to pause there now and would love to hear from you. So Maggie, are we able to hear from you now and see what we've gotten by way of chat or any comments?
Absolutely. So Maggie, thank you very much. This has been super interesting for me, and I've been scribbling different notes as you've been talking, so thank you very much. There have been lots of different comments in the chat. I've tried to share any that have come through to me privately. I've tried to share up so that everybody can see them. I think for me, one of the things that I might think, and I guess obviously it depends on your personality, is that, calling things out or disrupting can, can take courage for somebody to be bold if it maybe doesn't quite fit. If you've got any, maybe any advice or any examples of things that you've seen in other people that might be helpful for the group to hear as well.
Yeah, and there is absolutely, Maggie, the whole thing about being disruptive, you can be a quiet disruptor, but whatever the disruptive act is, that you just, I think, need to have some courage about it and some conviction about it. And it may not be perfect, whatever the act is, or the statement, or the comment, or the thought, but it needs you to get it from out of you and to be putting it out there for others to hear it, disagree with it, and so on. And that's the without knowing it. Sometimes we don't know the impact of what we're thinking and what we do. So it doesn't have to be loud, but it needs to be bold to be able to be disruptive.
Absolutely.
Now, sometimes you can be disruptive literally without knowing it. And then you get feedback and you think, whoa, where's that coming from? I didn't understand that. But I'm talking about active disruption that you can control. And again, I would say small things. Let's take small steps here. If it's your style that you just need to think about changing slightly or adapting or testing, test it with people that you trust to begin with.
Yeah.
In that way.
Yeah, I think that's a really good piece of advice. Doing it in a safe in a safe environment. We had when people were registering, people were able to ask some questions in advance, and one of the questions that came up, and I think you've obviously we've covered quite a lot of ground. This was somebody had asked specifically, how do you make an impact with a senior director who does not have time to speak?
Yeah.
Somebody who's just super busy and just won't make time for you. I don't know whether if you anything around that specific topic that you might.
Yeah, and sometimes we could be that leader who's too busy to speak as well. So there's a hierarchical comment here in this question, which I'll take, as opposed to a sideways peer-to-peer, I guess, as a colleague. So how do you make an impact with a senior director who does not have time to speak? What I've tried to do, and again, it might suit the person who's written the question, is that I try and find out what that senior director does listen to. Now, if I find out, whatever way I need to find out, that senior director listens to some people, but not me, first of all, I have to say, I'm just taking it on the face value here, that kind of hurts me. So I have to get over that. But I have to ask myself, so why does the senior director have time to speak to this person, this person, this person, but not me? And or, if the senior director is someone who is not giving time to anyone to speak, then I will try and find out, and maybe I wouldn't do it on my own, that's another thing I've learned actually. I'm all for standing up and being counted. I've done that one too many times in corporate life, and actually not everyone appreciates you being the sole voice, so I always ask for allies. So I would ask other people how they find the senior director, and it could be that we all think the same, 2 or 3 of us think the same. And then what I would do is find out, in any way which I can, what is that senior director interested in? And whatever that might be, hopefully a professional kind of work interest, I would then try and make a connection through that interest in some way. So let's just say that the senior director is not only very busy, in a positive way, doesn't have time for much of the team, let's say, because they're too busy firefighting or they're too busy having got pressure put on them. I'd find out that the senior director perhaps is under pressure and has targets to meet I don't know, or has a serious presentation every week to make to the board, whatever it might be. And what I would try and do is think about ways of trying to help that person undertake the work that they need to do. So therefore, I would like to think that I add value in that person's eyes to what we both can do together, is how I would try and tackle this. How do I make an impact? I check with just making sure that it wasn't just me. If it was not just me, I'd ask other people, have them together. We'd find out somehow, depending on the business, what's preoccupying the senior director. Is it just because they're just rude? Or is it because they're seriously stressed? And can we help with any of de-stressing that by helping with a presentation or whatever it is we need, or finding some research in that way? So that's what my first reaction to the question would be.
Great. And yeah, I do think that kind of finding that common ground, something that will make a connection, is a very useful piece of advice. I've got another question, actually, from Jay, who works with me actually at WEConnect, and she said human nature can make some people really defensive. She says, when I try to be a positive and constructive disruptor, what approach could she use to maybe make them less defensive and more receptive to her inputs?
Yeah, and thank you for that question, Jay. So, yeah, not everyone was going to think like you, me, or this group. Absolutely. And some people just don't see the way that we see it. And we have, of course, we know this. When I've worked with what I would call challenging people for me, I have to make, and this is my searchlight intelligence, some fairly rapid, depending on the situation, of course, some decisions, some thoughts, and so on. The worst case scenario is I extract myself from the situation when I think it's not safe. Psychologically, mentally, it's not safe, but also I don't think it's safe. So it's upsetting me too much, it's just too rude, it's just not working for me. That's what I'll do in an extreme way. And some of you will know that I worked on Millennium Dome in England, in London, and helped build the whole infrastructure, and it was in the limelight, and it was a pretty stressful situation. And it was quite a high-octane, volatile situation where we didn't always treat each other well. And I worked with people there who actually I didn't like. I don't think they liked me necessarily, but we had to work together. And it was at some point realizing that, you know what, there's a bigger thing than us in this, and we're tasked with getting it done. So can we bury the differences, or can we acknowledge them and agree not to go there, whatever it might be, is what you might describe as a mature adult way to work. But of course, we all have emotions and feelings, and sometimes I can behave like a child, actually. You can hurt me and I won't forgive you, and that's all to do with trust. So working with people who are difficult, different from you, getting them to respect you, want to work with you, or just not wanting to do so, at the end of the day, you have to assess for you what is best for you. What's going to get you up in the morning, going back into that environment, what do you need? And again, I would say I wouldn't do it on my own. I would seek allies. I mean, I don't know whether, Maggie, there's more there that we should be teasing out in Jay's question.
No, I think that's really helpful, and I think ultimately at the end of the day, although I know for me as an individual, I always want to like everybody, but always, it's not always possible, and then it's having a coping strategy with that to make the working relationship.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I mean, I think that's hopefully, Jay, that was some useful advice. I don't know, does anybody have any more questions or comments or anything that they'd like to share with Maggie just now? Please do use the chat function. I don't know, Maggie, if anybody has contacted you directly. So Osmond, what would you do? What would you do if your boss is unable to give you the air cover you need to effectively disrupt? And I think Osmond said earlier that they're in a new role.
Yeah.
New role, so getting that airtime to be able to, often when you come into a new organisation, you've got to make your mark.
Yeah, absolutely. And hopefully you're there to bring a bit of difference, particularly if it's a new role. But even if you've been in the organisation for some time, you still want to be yourself engaged and curious and be motivated and energised by the environment in which you work with. But Osmond, thank you for the question. What would you do if your boss is unable to give you the air cover you need to effectively disrupt? Well, I have to tell you, take it somewhere else. So you've got your hierarchical line of your boss, who's there to monitor, to encourage whatever the boss is there to do, but won't give you the air cover because they're too focused on something else. And it could be that your boss has what Howard Gardner talks laser intelligence. They're so focused on the here and now and what needs to be done, so they don't have the bandwidth, the intention, or the thought to be able to open up slightly so that there can be a bit of disruption that they can recognize. If I had a boss who was unable to give me air cover, and I have worked in those environments where the boss has not been able to do this for me, I've stepped back, not tried to do everything I wanted to do straight away. I'm a little impatient sometimes. I think the world should change quickly and so on. But it's out of, you're saying, Oslam here, out of avoidance of conflict. So you don't want to have a fight with someone, but you just want them to see your way of seeing things. And I think that's by gentle, step-by-step. In a meeting, there might be a comment made. You might just insert quietly, subtly, another little comment just to get people thinking differently. But no big thing. You're not making a big thing of it. And then, and for me, it's about you being consistent in your messaging so that your boss particularly doesn't see it as a threat or doesn't see you as an irritant, because disruptors can be irritating people too if they're too full on. So I would say, Oslam, yeah, you've got a boss who's working with you, who I hope values you, is energizing you. Maybe, I'm just being empathetic to your boss now, is too focused on that laser incision of what they need to deliver to here, today, now. But you want to bring some additional thinking, and I would do it in quiet, small ways, in whichever way you can. Meetings, if they're positive ones, could be where you insert under any other business. I don't know how your business runs, but is there something here that you want to say? Can you say to someone, I've just read this LinkedIn article, this paper. I tend to give my team here just references to things to read, particularly when I'm thinking about introducing something that they think is disruptive, because they call me a disruptor. So I would do it subtly and quietly and gently to avoid the conflict. So you're not a threat, and you're not moving the whole thinking of the boss to somewhere else, which they might think is distraction, but I would bring it to this is what we might want to think about for the future in that way. Hope that's helpful, Oslam, but that's what I would do. Thanks, Maggie.
Thank you, Maggie. Well, look, we're literally 1 minute before the hour, so nobody else has shared any more questions, but certainly you've put your contact details on here, so absolutely, if you've comments or questions or things that you'd like to share with Maggie or indeed the group, please do pass them on and share them. But Maggie, this has been great. Thank you so much. I always enjoy listening to your presentations. Some of you may have heard Maggie speak at our conference last year, and she did a brilliant session there. And this has been as interesting as well. So thank you so much. Thank you to all of you for dialing in and for participating. I'm going to share the slides, and I'm sure you can look at some of the resources that Maggie referenced on I think it was just the slide before this one, around different things to look up. So, and lots of people are replying and saying very interesting and stimulating, a very interesting presentation. Thanks very much. So lots of people saying thank you very much, which is great. Oh, and her voice, which is fab. So listen, thank you very much, Maggie. This was great. I very much appreciate your sharing your insight for everybody this afternoon. I hope everybody's enjoyed it, and I hope that some of you will join another WEConnect International webinar. We'll have more running through to the end of the year and into 2019. So thanks very much, everybody, and thank you, Maggie.
Thank you. Bye.
Take care, everybody.